Hello and welcome to our presentation on the levels of racism, brought to you by Student-Led Ed. Our organization is creating webinars ranging in a number of subjects related to culturally responsive teaching, made possible in part by a grant received from National Geographic Education's COVID-19 Remote Learning Emergency Fund for Educators. To learn more about National Geographic's COVID-19 Remote Learning Emergency Fund, check out their attached link in the description box. Today we'll be looking at systemic racism, which can be defined as a form of racism that is seen in establishments, laws, policies, and practices that are designed to hinder the success of people of color. Interpersonal racism, which can be defined as a form of racism that is seen in interactions between people, usually between white people and people of color, that show the prejudice, bias, and bigoted feelings held against people of color, as well as how they both can be found in different areas of life and society. We will first be talking about systemic racism, and in this we will discuss two topics, redlining and food deserts. Redlining. What is redlining? Redlining was a form of systemic racism that denied people of color home ownership loans by labeling the neighborhoods that they lived in as poor and of financial risk. How has redlining impacted wealth? In the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, federal agencies, including the Federal Housing Administration, systematically denied African American families loans and the right to buy homes in suburbs, while doing the opposite for white families. Black families were restricted to redline neighborhoods, where they gained less than half as much home equity than their white counterparts. This was the main cause of the huge wealth gap between black and white people. What are the effects still seen today? Today, the impacts of redlining are still around, despite the implementation of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Most cities in America are still segregated, and the wealth gap that was created in the years of redlining still exists. According to Forbes and Statista, this is seen in jobless rates with black people at 11.4% versus white people at 7.3%. Median household net worths with black people at $17,150 versus white people at $171,000. And likeliness of home ownership, with black families being 40% less likely than white families to own a home. What are some possible solutions? Provide more employment opportunities, raise minimum wages, raise taxes for rich people, provide free health care, provide small business loans, and invest in minority communities. Food deserts. What are food deserts? Food deserts are common in low-income, minority neighborhoods and are areas with unequal access to nutritious food in supermarkets as compared to a food oasis. Instead, they are filled with unhealthy fast food restaurants and small convenience stores. What is their impact on health? As a result of food deserts, the overall health of many people in minority communities is on a decline. According to Johns Hopkins magazine, a number of very young African American women are at risk for cardiovascular diseases. People only about 30 years old are faced with obesity, diabetes, and even hypertension. In addition to living in food deserts, these people barely have access to parks or gyms that can help them improve their health, or transportation options to get them to and from the nearest supermarket, leaving them in an unhealthy limbo or cycle. What are some possible solutions? Building federally funded supermarkets in low-income neighborhoods, reducing the number of fast food restaurants, improving accessibility through better public transportation, and establishing small farmers markets with healthy options. Now we will be talking about interpersonal racism, and in this we will discuss 6 topics: overt racism, covert racism, microaggressions and macroaggressions, racial colorblindness, stereotypes, and the Karen trope. Overt and covert racism. Overt racism. While both forms are harmful in their own ways, unlike covert racism, overt racism is intentional, blatant, and obvious. It stems from the ideologies of white supremacy, the belief that the white race should be above all others. These ideologies have conditioned many people into thinking that white characteristics are better through businesses, institutions, and social media. When someone is being overly racist, you can clearly see the hate they have for other races with their attitudes, mannerisms, aggressions, and insults. And overt racists will not hide behind any pretenses or try to mask their direct racialism. These are the racists that will call you the N-word to your face, hard ER. These are the races that will belittle you by insulting everything that makes you who you are. These are the racists who will tell you to go back to your country, tell you that you don't belong here. They must have forgotten that they claim stolen land. These are the racists that will proudly wave their Confederate flags. These are the racists that will call your beautiful 4C hair nappy or unruly. These are the racists that will call the police when they see black people having fun. It seems like they just can't mind their business. These are the racists that would have a heart attack if they saw their children playing with black kids. Racism is not instinctive, it is taught. These are the racists that set the system against us. We can't win in a place where we were never meant to. These are the racists that will harass you and question if a person who looks like you really drives that fancy car and lives in the big mansion in that expensive neighborhood. They think we will always be beneath them. These racists are the reason why we scream Black Lives Matter. Covert racism. Covert racism is a form of racial discrimination that is disguised and subtle, rather than public or obvious. I will be reading a piece that thoroughly conveys covert racism and its impacts. Dear people of color, hi, I'm a racist named Covert. I built this shady type of racist system. Will I come out and call you the N-word? Nah, I like hitting you in different fields. I'm the racist who thinks you're stealing in a store even though you work there. I make it hard for you to get a job if your name sounds foreign. If you wear a weave or a do-rag, I make people think you are unprofessional. But if you have your natural hair out, it needs to be flat ironed because your curls aren't cute. I made lighter skin tones the beauty standard, and if you're darker, you are more violent and considered ugly. No wonder why white dolls are sold more than brown. Anyway, I'm the reason why you and your parents have to whiten your voice on phone calls or you sound aggressive and loud. And we don't want to be loud. If your English is not correct, you will need to fix that if you want to make it far in America. I'm the one who puts the gas stations and liquor stores in your neighborhoods and make you drive miles into white neighborhoods to get real supplies. If you want healthier foods and better resources, then clean up your streets and don't steal. I also control what y'all learn in school. I made sure the first lesson in history class introduces you as slaves and uncivilized people who needed white people to clean you up. Because it's not like those people didn't have their own calendar, mathematics system, traditions, culture, religion, language, and ways of life. No, you were all just savages. Still are. But you get the idea, right? I, covert racism, make sure white people don't struggle because of their race. I make you do it for them. I give them their privilege. I tell everyone about how equal the system is, but remind you every day that you can't amount to anything unless you're entertaining us by being a singer, dancer, or athlete. Plain and simple. You have a problem with that? Well, don't protest, because you may be arrested, beaten, or killed. Don't kneel for the national anthem because you may lose your job. Don't try to build organizations and speak out against injustices like me because you may be kidnapped and lynched. And if you don't do that, you're fine. You know, besides getting sent to prison for minor or false offenses, or getting shot by authorities that swore to serve and protect you, I protect them. I guess the only way y'all can stop me is by voting, and I make sure it's hard for you to even make it that far. Anyway, I will be expecting a letter back from you all. It is nice meeting the new generation I'll be affecting. Best regards, covert racism. Microaggressions. Unlike over-racism and similar to covert racism, the term microaggressions was coined in 1970 by Dr. Chester Pierce and defined by psychologist Daryl Twing-Sue in 2007 as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults to marginalized individuals or groups. So basically, they are the backhanded compliments, the small actions that are fueled by racist stereotypes but hold much weight. Sometimes they can even be unintentional. Sometimes people don't realize how racist they're being. You may have heard comments or questions like, "Where are you from?" No, where are you really from? Wow, you are so articulate for an insert minority race here. You're pretty for a black or dark-skinned girl. I can't pronounce your name. Can I give you a nickname? How about Joe? Sam? You talk white. You don't act like your people. I don't see color. I like your hair more when it's straight. You may have seen actions like someone holding their wallet or purse close to them when a person of color walks by. a customer of color being followed around or watched closely in a store, refusal or hesitance to get on an elevator with a person of color, a person of color being mistaken for an employee or service worker, someone randomly touching a black woman's hair. Microaggressions are harmful in that they are inappropriate, disrespectful, and derogatory. While they may not always be intentional and can even come from people of color as well, they are still insulting and can result in negative impacts to the person on the receiving end of these comments or actions. Microaggressions pin stereotypes onto people of color and make people feel uncomfortable, insecure, incapable, unimportant, alienated, and so much more. It's the littlest things that have the biggest impacts. On the other hand, people also face something called macroaggressions. Macroaggressions, oppositely to microaggressions, are larger acts of racism directed towards whole minority groups rather than one or a few individuals at a time. One of the most clear examples of macroaggressions in recent years come directly from former President Donald Trump. The biggest aspect of Trump's campaign promise was to build a large border wall in hopes of reducing Mexican immigration into the United States. In this, Trump would throw around comments like, "They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists." Comments like this can be labeled as microaggressions because they unnecessarily target a whole group of people with insults that aren't true for every person belonging to that group. Comments like this are harmful because they directly into racial stereotypes from microaggressions and make it that much harder for people to work against them. Because of the nature of microaggressions and macroaggressions and how they differ from each other yet feed into each other, they are also compared to covert and overt racism. Colorblindness. What is colorblindness? Colorblindness is white people's claim that racial privilege no longer exists. It's a form of racism because people need to see color in order to acknowledge the injustices and inequalities that people of color face. Claiming to not see color means being oblivious to the problems that others' races face. What is the impact of colorblindness? The impact that racial colorblindness has on different races is serious, because when people say things like this, they are basically dismissing the notion that racism still exists. Saying "I don't see color" is wrong, because it doesn't give people the opportunity to discuss race and examine their own bias. What can you do? A solution to colorblindness is holding yourself accountable and making sure that you realize what is impacting society around you and taking note of how you can help rather than being a part of the problem. Stereotypes. What are stereotypes? A stereotype is defined as a mistaken idea or belief many people have about a thing or group that is based upon how they look on the outside, which may be untrue or only partly true. What are some examples? An example of stereotyping is thinking someone is athletic because they're African American. Another example of racist stereotyping is thinking someone is ghetto because they are black. What effects are still seen today? Stereotyping still has an impact on us in today's world, especially because stereotypes are still going around. They are harmful because they make it easy for people to misjudge others without knowing who they truly are. Stereotyping and racism play hand in hand, as stereotyping can be another form of racism and is just as bad. What can be done? A solution to this is that people need to stop believing stereotypes, correct others when they hear them, and get to know someone before prejudging them instead of going off what others say. The Karen trope. What is a Karen? A Karen is a slang term for an obnoxious, angry, entitled, and racist white woman who uses her privilege to get their way. It was originally created on Black Twitter to bring awareness to white women who use white supremacy and their privilege as weapons against Black people, but as it becomes more popular, people use it to describe entitled and demanding women. How are they harmful? When things don't go their way, they melt down and cry. They also pretend to have been seriously threatened or harmed. Society, and white men especially, come running to protect or defend them, which has catastrophic consequences. We've seen this in cases like the Tulsa Massacre and Emmett Till. Now we'll be talking about a few topics in which systemic racism as well as interpersonal racism can be found. Racism in healthcare, law enforcement, education, and job hiring. Racism in healthcare. Systemic racism is seen in healthcare through inequalities, mortality rates, and employment rates. Healthcare inequalities. Healthcare inequalities are differences in health status or the distribution of resources because of race. Factors include a lack of access to adequate health coverage, communication difficulties between patient and provider, provider stereotyping, a lack of access to providers, and cultural barriers. Disproportionate mortality rates. Even though there have been many technological advances in the diagnosis and treatment of most chronic illnesses, minorities tend to receive lower quality health care than their white counterparts. Therefore, minorities experience more morbidity from those chronic illnesses. There are more white doctors than any other race. Black patients are more than twice as likely to die of preventable heart disease and stroke. A study done by Stanford University found that Black doctors were more likely to write detailed notes about Black patients. Thus, having more doctors of color alone could reduce the Black-white mortality gap due to heart disease by 19%. Interpersonally, we see racism in healthcare in residents being treated badly by attending higher-ups. Medical students starting their residency programs also face much discrimination in their training. From the moment they start, their capabilities are extremely underestimated. As a result, they are forced to work harder than their peers just to prove that they deserve to be doctors as well, which just feeds into imposter syndrome. We also see patients talking down to healthcare workers of color. Healthcare workers don't only have to worry about facing discrimination from their bosses. Sometimes, their own patients also see them as less qualified than their white counterparts and doubt their capabilities, despite them going through the same education and training. As a result, their medical advice is not always regarded or followed, and they can even have disrespectful interactions with patients. Racism in law enforcement. We see systemic racism in law enforcement through incarceration and employment rates as well. Incarceration inequalities. Racism is also found in prison incarceration rates. The United States population is overwhelmingly white. However, prison incarceration rates don't nearly reflect this. According to the Sentencing Project, 62% of the U.S. population is white, 17% is Hispanic, and 13% is Black. Unreflectingly, 35% of state prisoners are white, 21% are Hispanic, and 38% are Black. This clearly shows that Black people are in prison at much higher rates than their white and Hispanic counterparts, even though they make up the smallest portion of the population among those three groups. There are more white officers than any other race. Additionally, there are more white police officers in America than any other race. According to Data USA, about 61.3% of police officers are white and only about 11.9% are Black. While a lot of people will not see a problem with these numbers, they actually show why it is so easy for prejudiced police officers to abuse their power and be discriminatory towards people of color. Interpersonally, we also see officers using abusive power on people of color. Police brutality is when police officers use unnecessary and brute force against citizens in an abuse of power. Many times, these actions are as a result of racist police officers being unable to control themselves. A clear example of police brutality is the murder of George Floyd by then police officer Derek Chauvin. Police brutality continues on because most times officers aren't held accountable for their actions. Because of this, others think they can do whatever they want and not have to face any consequences. Racism in education and the workplace. Racism in education. We see systemic racism in education through funding and segregation, in which we also see interpersonal racism. Property taxes or funding. Property and locally raised taxes make up about a half of education funding. This explains why schools across different communities have very different approaches. Schools in high-income communities have the best opportunities and facilities for their students, while the opposite is seen at schools in low-income communities. Segregated schools. Segregated schools are also a result of unequal funding. Students of schools in high-income neighborhoods are mostly white, while schools of low-income neighborhoods mostly hold students of color. This does nothing but continue the cycle of unequal education that favors white students. Part of the problem as well are white parents who claim to be liberal thinkers and that they want to diversify schools as well as have equal opportunities across communities. However, at the same time, they are not really helping to segregate schools because they keep their own children at their private and mostly white schools and even make it harder for students of color to have access to more opportunities. Predominantly white institutions. Because students of color are usually unable to get the best education, like their white counterparts, they have limited options for further education. White students typically have access to the best universities in the country as their education is top tier and they have the resources to pay for things like SAT tutoring to make sure their applications look as good as possible, thus keeping predominantly white institutions predominantly white. Without the same opportunities, students of color are usually forced to go to local community colleges that they can afford, while others don't even have the opportunity to pursue higher education at all. Racism in job hiring and the workplace. Under this topic, systemic racism can be seen in hiring processes and unemployment rates. Interpersonal racism is seen more commonly in workplace discrimination. Discrimination in hiring. Discrimination in the job hiring process is when employers use discriminatory practices against job applicants on the basis of their race, sex, religion, nationality, age, or disability. For example, many people have been denied job opportunities as employers turn them away simply for having Black-sounding names. Because of discrimination in hiring like this, many well-qualified people of color are turned away from jobs that are given to white counterparts with significantly less qualifications. Unemployment rates. Discrimination in hiring leads directly to disproportionate unemployment rates. According to Statista, white Americans have the lowest unemployment rates in the U.S. at 7.3%, while Puerto Ricans have the highest at 11.7%. Further, unemployment rates remain high for other minority groups like Black people at 11.4%, Hispanics and Latinos at 10.4%, Mexican Americans at 9.9%, Cubans at 9.4%, and Asians at 8.7%, as the national average sits at 8.1%. Discrimination in the workplace. Additionally, job discrimination doesn't end at hiring and unemployment rates. Once in the workplace, people of color constantly face discrimination from their bosses, leaders, and even peers or co-workers. Employees of color are consistently belittled and underestimated. They face microaggressions and racist comments on a daily basis. More seriously, they are usually passed up for promotions despite the hard work they put into their jobs. Some corporations even go as far as to design policies that directly target their employees of color, like rules that ban locks or label natural hair as unprofessional, for example. As a result, many people of color end up quitting their jobs to protect themselves from the discrimination they are always faced with, which is completely unfair to them as they deserve to be there as much as anyone else does. We will close our presentation today with some action steps that can be taken. How you can start being an ally today. The first step to being an ally is to recognize the privilege that you have based on your identity, whether it stems from your socioeconomic standing, race, religion, gender, nationality, sexual orientation, or more. Like people say, you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Don't try to speak for people of color. Instead, listen to them and help magnify their voices. Don't look to people of color to educate you about the things they go through. Instead, be responsible for your own learning and stay aware of the injustices that go on around you. Make sure to hold any prejudiced people around you accountable for the bigoted things they say and do. Finally, to begin making a change in your society, acknowledge your past actions and learn from them so that you may do better in the future. Actions that can be taken within schools. A lot of times, the many racist comments, insults, and jokes are overlooked and disregarded. The complaints aren't taken seriously and conflicts remain unresolved. One of the only ways to get rid of racism is to address it. Being an adult authority or in a position of power, you can play a huge role in bringing racism to a halt in your schools. The first step is to immediately address any form of bullying or racism you see. That means you have to be observant and attentive of what is going on in your halls. You need to make sure that you are assertive in not tolerating any of this, and you need to make sure that you are backing up this assertiveness with the right actions. For example, making aggressors face repercussions for their actions, being supportive to students facing the aggressions, encouraging others to stand up for themselves and each other, having hard conversations, and so much more. Thank you.